in 2 Corinthians chapter 7. Paul is writing to the church here, and Paul, when I read his letters to the Corinthians, to the church at Corinth, it's like he has this love-hate relationship, or like this struggle. I mean, the struggle is real here, where he is speaking to the church, and he's actually suffered a lot, probably more emotionally than he has physically with this church. He seems to be very connected to them, but they also seem to be stubborn and seem to be maybe they're unruly, his unruly child. And so we see that there's a lot of conflict, but we see something beautiful happen in this chapter 7. We see that Paul is speaking to the church at Corinth, that we know that he is heavy-hearted, that he has had to discipline this church maybe more than one time. And the discipline caused a lot of heartache and a lot of suffering, specifically with Paul. And we see that Paul here has written a severe letter to the church, and he has sent it by Titus. Titus has brought this letter, and so Paul's awaiting for Titus's return to see how did they receive this letter. And he even goes through this point where he's almost to a point of like regret. Like he regrets that he has sent the letter and he was so severe in this letter. And he's worried about what's going to happen. What word is Titus bringing back, right? I mean, Titus couldn't just send him a quick text message, just say, hey, everything's okay, or hey, send help, things have gone downhill bad, right? And so he's waiting for Titus to return to him. Paul is worried. Should he have even sent this letter? How are they going to receive it? What are they going to say? What's going to happen? And then we see something beautiful happen. We see here in the middle to latter part of this chapter, we see something beautiful. We see that Titus did return, that Titus gave Paul a great word, that they, the church, the Corinthians, they received this letter, and they received this letter with repentance. Now, I do want to stop there, because when we look, we see actually there's two types of repentance that Paul pens here. There's one repentance that is more like Judas. That is repentance where he is worried and almost regretful and repentant of even sending the letter. And that's where Paul was at. Paul was like, man, I shouldn't have even done that. He was kind of full of regret and full of just this worry. And that repentance that Paul uses there is similar to the one of Judas, where it was all about him. It was this grief, this inward grief. Man, why did I even do that? And he was full of shame and regret. And we see what happened to Judas. We know what happened to Judas, where he eventually took his own life, because he was full of that repentance. But then he also talks about the repentance that the church at Corinth, how they received the letter that Paul sent him. And this was like the repentance of Peter. When Peter denied Jesus, he was repentant, he was sorrowful, he wept and he grieved. But then he ran to Jesus, right? He continued on mission for Jesus. This repentance that Peter, the same repentance that the church at Corinth experienced and expressed, was this repentance that pushed them towards God. And so we see now that at the end of this, that Paul is full of joy. He is grateful that he wrote the letter, not because he caused sorrow, not because he caused them hurt, but because the sorrow led to repentance filled with their love for God, and that they ran to God and not to the world, right? In verse 10 it says, for godly grief produces a repentance that leads to salvation without regret, but worldly grief produces death. And so Paul is full of joy. I could just imagine his stomach is full of knots. He's worried what's going to happen. Where is Titus? What's taking so long? What's going on? What is the church? What are they? How did they receive this letter? What are they thinking? What are they doing? And then Titus shows up. He says they received him well. Titus says things went well. It was received well. They were sorrowful. They grieved. They repented, and they turned towards God. Guys, as Christians, as the church, when we do this well, right, when we help lead people through hard times, there are broken relationships everywhere. Families, friends, relationships with spouses, relationships inside of ministry, inside of the church. These broken relationships are everywhere. All right, we are all broken in this broken world. But when we lead through hard times well, right, we see that Paul, he showed appreciation and love for that church. Multiple times he is talking about how he loves them and how he is grateful for them, right? That they are his writings, that they are the proof of his ministry. He shows appreciation for the church, but then he also he allows for that separation, right? I like to fix things. I like to go in and play the fixer-upper. But we see that that's not always right. And so Paul, we see that he practiced separation, giving time away and keeping time, allowing to have time between him and the church, keeping distance and separation, which is a good thing. But then we see also that he brings forth, right, the will of God and for reconciliation. And we see that he speaks truth, and he speaks it biblically, and he speaks it out of love, but he speaks it like it is. And so we see when those things happen, we see something beautiful that can take place. It doesn't always take place, but we see a beautiful evidence what happens when we deal with conflict. We deal with it biblically, and we deal with it with love. That reconciliation can happen, restoration can happen, and that's what happens here with Paul and the church at Corinth and what they were going through. So may we be the light that Paul demonstrates here in chapter 7 of 2 Corinthians, of the gospel of Jesus Christ and of reconciliation. Guys, I love you. Have a blessed day.